We'll hear next from foreign affairs analysts on the U.S. relationship with Cuba and moves by the Trump administration to limit travel to the Caribbean nation. This was hosted by the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington, D.C. It's an hour and a half.
Good morning. Welcome to the Inter-American Dialogue. My name is Michael Camilleri. I direct the Dialogue's Peter D. Bell Rule of Law program. Almost 3 years ago, Presidents Obama and Castro embarked on a historic opening in relations between the United States and Cuba. 2 days ago, the Trump administration announced a series of regulatory changes designed to partially roll back the Obama administration's strategy of maximizing engagement with the people of Cuba. And a few months from now, Cuba will undergo a historic leadership transition while reckoning with a moribund economy, demographic challenges, and a relationship with the United States that is rapidly deteriorating as a result of President Trump's policy changes and still unresolved sonic attacks against U.S. diplomats. In fact, the diplomatic drawdown in Havana had a direct impact on this event, as the suspension of visa services in Havana prevented us from bringing a speaker from Cuba to participate in today's discussion. Nonetheless, to help us make sense of all that's happened in recent months and assess what the future might bring for Cuba and the United States and for U.S.-Cuba relations, we are privileged to welcome to the dialogue three distinguished friends and colleagues with decades of experience working on Cuba. To my immediate left, Emily Mandrala is the Executive Director of the Center for Democracy in the Americas. Emily served in the Obama administration at the National Security Council and in the Cuban Affairs Office at the State Department, and was previously a professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Mike Bustamante is an assistant professor of Latin American history at Florida International University, specializing in modern Cuba, Cuban-Americans, and the Caribbean. He is co-editor of the volume New Histories of the Cuban Revolution. And Jorge Dominguez is the Antonio Madero Professor for the Study of Mexico at Harvard University and chair of the Harvard Academy for International and Area Studies. He is the author of or editor of various books, a former president of the Latin American Studies Association, and not least, a member of the Inter-American Dialogue. Before diving into the conversation, I'd like to quickly acknowledge our partners at the World Press Photo Exhibition. For over 60 years, more than 4 million people in 100 cities around the globe have enjoyed the work of award-winning photographers. Today, we are fortunate to enjoy Tomas Monita's On the Edge of Change series, and it's really evocative and visually stunning depictions of everyday life in Cuba. You'll see these cycling through throughout the discussion today. We also want to acknowledge the support of the Ford Foundation, and particularly Mario Bronfman, without whom this event would not have been possible. And I'd like to acknowledge two of my colleagues here at the Dialogue, President Emeritus Peter Hakem, and our colleague Luis Carlos Batista, a Cuban-American lawyer who provides invaluable support to the Rule of Law program. And finally, if anybody from OFAC is here, rest assured the coffee and donuts were not provided by Gaesa. So with that, we'll dive into the discussion. Each of our panelists will speak for about 10 minutes, delivering opening remarks, and then we'll open it up for discussion. We'll have plenty of time for your questions and comments. So Emily, let's start with you.
Great, thanks. If you were to put U.S.-Cuba relations on a line graph, if you were to plot it with engagement on the y-axis, it would be a jagged line for sure. We've taken 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 1 step forward, 2 steps back over several decades. But the long-term trend line is decidedly in the upward direction. And this time last year, so October 2016, the Obama administration released the 6th of 6 rounds of regulatory changes governing U.S.-Cuba sanctions. And each round of regulatory changes was designed to increase the flow of people, goods, and information to and from Cuba. And these were couched in a larger policy of engagement over 2 years, during the final 2 years of the Obama administration, the U.S. and Cuban governments met regularly, engaged in dialogue on a number of issues, and ultimately signed almost 24 bilateral agreements. And these agreements touched on issues such as law enforcement information sharing, cooperation on health, designating sister marine protected areas. These were really wide-ranging discussions on a number of issues. And so I'd say this time last year we were on a pretty steep part of the line graph in the upward direction. And more than anything, those 2 years of rapid progress toward normalization proved that the U.S. and Cuban governments can cooperate and that the cooperation can bear fruit. And I think that's really important because after decades of not cooperating, it wasn't a sure thing that this cooperation could bear fruit. And in fact, if you look at the last 3 years, we've seen that in fact it did. This week, everyone's aware, and Michael just mentioned it, that we've had a downward tick on the line graph with the release of new regulations governing Cuba sanctions. The Treasury Department and Commerce Department govern the implementation of sanctions toward Cuba, and they released some new rules that will in part roll back and in part change U.S. travel to Cuba and the financial transactions with which U.S. entities can participate in Cuba. And then the State Department, in concert with this, released a list of 180 prohibited entities with whom U.S. persons cannot engage in direct financial transactions. This announcement was the fulfillment of a June announcement that President Trump made in Miami, where he directed departments and agencies to begin to draft these rules. So we've been expecting them for some time. And in fact, I would argue that the downward tick that we've seen this week is in fact not very severe. And I'll get into why. But the specific changes that were announced this week with regard to travel, individuals were previously able to travel under the people-to-people category and now are no longer able to do so. However, they are allowed to travel as individuals under the support for the Cuban people category. And there is a new definition for the support for the Cuban people category that allows for people to stay at private bed and breakfast, eat at private restaurants, and there's a requirement that individuals do a little something else to constitute a full-time itinerary under this category, but individuals can still travel to Cuba. I think that's the big takeaway. There's also, most notably, I think the State Department's list of 180 prohibited entities are a number of hotels where individuals cannot stay, a number of stores in Old Havana where individuals cannot shop, a number of government entities with whom U.S. businesses cannot do business. And in the coming days and weeks, and I know that it's already happened in many respects, lawyers will be poring over these new rules to determine what are the avenues for continued engagement. But it's important to know that engagement can continue. And a lot of what the progress over the last 3 years has been preserved. We still have U.S. Embassy in Havana. The Cubans have an embassy here in Washington. Americans or U.S. travelers can still travel to Cuba and can enjoy a lot of the flexibility that was implemented during the Obama administration. General licenses, for example. Oftentimes, or now, travelers do not need to seek specific permission from the Treasury Department to travel. They can self-certify that their travel meets the rules governing U.S. sanctions. That remains in place. Dialogue will continue. The U.S. and Cuban governments have made clear that they'll continue to dialogue on areas of mutual interest, and so it's not by any means even close to a full reversal of the gains toward engagement that we've seen over recent years. And all of this comes at a time where there is considerable momentum. U.S. travelers are continuing to travel to Cuba. In May of this year, we already reached the mark of the number of U.S. travelers to Cuba for the entire calendar year of 2016. This comes at a time where there's congressional momentum, bipartisan congressional momentum. Representative Rick Crawford has introduced a bill to allow for the use of financing in agricultural sales, and there are now 44 Republicans in the House on that bill. And in the Senate, a bill to lift the travel ban has 55 total senators signed on to that bill, and that's a majority. So I think that it's important to realize that there is a path, a steady path of momentum from travelers, Congress, and also the private sector. Just last week, we saw John Deere and Caterpillar sign some pretty big deals at the trade fair in Havana, and it demonstrates that there may be some negative news and negative rhetoric coming out of the U.S. government, but it can't quite put back in the bottle what was unleashed over the last 2.5 years. But there are challenges, and I think we'll hear more about those in a little bit from other panelists. But for example, there's a leadership transition in Cuba coming up in February, and we don't yet know what that will bring. And also, we are operating currently at skeleton staffs, the U.S. Embassy in Havana and the Cuban Embassy in Washington. And this comes as a result of mysterious symptoms experienced by U.S. diplomats and Canadian diplomats, and an ongoing investigation into those symptoms. And the U.S. has drawn down our diplomats from Havana, and it's important to understand, issued a travel warning alongside it, but the travel warning in many respects is triggered bureaucratically by the drawing down of our diplomats. The next step, though, that the U.S. took to expel Cuban diplomats from Washington, or to request that 60% of the Cuban diplomats from Washington leave, seems to be a bit of a step too far, or at least a step that begs the question, why, in the midst of an ongoing investigation, did the U.S. government ask the Cuban embassy to draw down their diplomats, and do so in a way where they handed a list, reportedly handed a list of 15 specific names to the Cuban embassy, names that gutted the commercial section and the consular section of the Cuban embassy in Washington. And I mentioned that, and the investigation into the arguably serious symptoms experienced by our diplomats is ongoing, and we don't yet know what that will turn up. But I say that to note that while we have taken a step back, or are on the downward path of the line graph right now, it's not quite as bad as it could be, but there are some challenges on the horizon.
Great, that's terrific. Thanks, Emily. Mike, let's go to you.
Thanks so much. Good morning. Thanks so much to the Dialogue for having me and for organizing this event. I was asked to focus my opening remarks on the Cuban-American community, how we, I should say, as part of it, fit into the present picture of U.S.-Cuban relations, how we're responding to or being affected by some of the developments that were just mentioned. It's no secret that there are vocal voices in the Cuban-American community that are very much behind the recent changes in U.S.-Cuba policy that were just announced yesterday. So that begs the question, is there a constituency there that supports these efforts, or are there other voices? Let me just start with some context. For the past, I think, approaching 20 years, if I'm not mistaken, the university where I work, Florida International University, has conducted a rigorous poll every year on Cuban-American political attitudes and opinions. And what that poll shows is that there is a steady trend line, to mention another trend line, of shifting Cuban diaspora opinion on matters of U.S.-Cuba policy. There is strong majority support in the Cuban-American community for the right of all Americans to travel to the island. There is majority support for ending the embargo. But there is particularly strong support, almost universal, I would say, for the right of Cuban-Americans to travel to the island to see family whenever they wish. And so it's not surprising that of all the changes that have been implemented in U.S.-Cuban relations and U.S.-Cuba policy since June, this is one that hasn't been touched. And I don't think that that's a mistake or a coincidence. Before the Obama administration, one of the other real restrictions that was in place was a quite severe limit on the ability of Cuban Americans in particular to visit the island and see their families. The Obama administration got rid of that very early on before D-17. And I think those against engagement in Miami have recognized certainly that it is a political loser for them to start telling their constituents when they can go see mom. And so there's a key way in which the Cuban American community is therefore not affected by some of the recent changes, right? Their ability to travel to the island in theory remains free and unfettered. And so I think that contributes to a dynamic sometimes in which many folks in Miami who are by no means single issue voters, the broader noise in U.S.-Cuban relations might not register as much insofar as their own ability to go back and forth is not impacted. But there are other clear ways in which the Cuban American community is affected by recent developments. To the extent that there are less U.S. visitors overall, a kind of rich transnational economy, flow of people, goods, money, may also be impacted. Cuban Americans that travel to the island don't only go to hug mom, they go to bring cash on the order of several $billions a year in remittances that is both to support their loved ones on the island, but also fuels, as I said, a kind of rich transnational economy, a supply chain by suitcase, if you will, for many sectors of the Cuban economy, and also the black market, we have to acknowledge. So I think while Cuban Americans in theory can continue traveling and bringing all the stuff on planes that they do, if we see U.S. Airlines cutting back on flights, if we see less U.S. visitors kind of have an impact in the small business sector, generally that might slow some of that transnational motion insofar as it's connected to particularly the tourist sector. The most important consequence, though, that I would argue that the Cuban American community is going to feel is a reflection in the reduction of staff both at the U.S. Embassy in Havana and the Cuban Embassy here in Washington. The end of the wet foot, dry foot policy in the waning days of the Obama administration was a tough pill to swallow for, I think, the Cuban diaspora in general, although everybody saw it coming. This was kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. As soon as a process of normalization began, it stood to reason that a pretty non-normal immigration policy vis-a-vis Cubans was perhaps destined to eventually fade away. And so Cubans began to leave the island in really record numbers, the highest numbers we've seen in some 30 years. Sort of the attitude was, if you're gonna go, you gotta go now. And that, of course, only accelerated the speed with which the wet foot dry policy would come to an end. So if that was a bitter pill to swallow that I think Cubans had a tough time swallowing, but they understood perhaps where it was coming from, what's happened now with the reduction of U.S. staff at the embassy and the fact that there is no functioning consulate there, that closes yet another avenue of outmigration. And not just outmigration, but just travel. The number of visitors' visas that Cubans were getting in recent years to come to the United States was not unsubstantial. And this has left a lot of people in limbo. I'm forgetting the exact stat, but I think I read that the U.S. Embassy or the U.S. Consulate in Havana had one of the largest numbers of sort of pending visa applications, period. Maybe something like 100,000, if I'm not mistaken. And now it's totally unclear what's going to happen there. The State Department has said that the issuing of immigrant visas is going to be moved to Bogota, Colombia. Not a very practical solution. For many reasons, for reasons of cost, for the reason that Cubans need a visa to get to Colombia, and to get a visa to Colombia that they need to prove that they have a certain amount in the bank, right? And the fact that when you apply for a visa and go for your interview, you don't necessarily get a decision right away. You might have to wait. So what's a Cuban supposed to do? Go back to Havana and then come back with another visa? I mean, this is a real setback. So even for the immigrant visa piece, I think this is really going to lead to sharp declines of the amount of Cubans who are coming to the United States. And this has implications for what is still an important bilateral agreement between the US and Cuban governments, dating back to the 90s, where the US is supposed to issue a minimum of 20,000 travel documents for legal travel. And I have a hard time figuring out how via Bogota they're going to meet that mark. They've also still not made clear whether there's going to be any process for issuing visitors visas, and that also slows down this kind of transnational flow. So this does have serious impacts. This is an area, I would say, of kind of political vulnerability for representatives from Miami who are defending this policy change, but whose constituents are really suffering these practical effects. In Miami, it is completely possible to be a member of any political party, to have voted for the current president or not, and still believe that you want to bring your sister over to come live with you. And so I think to the extent that this drags on, this is going to be a real problem, and I think something that constituents are going to, that I hope will tell their representatives about. So let me just conclude with a kind of a question and a tentative answer, or set of answers. I've argued that Cuban-American opinion on matters of US policy toward Cuba has consistently shifted, and yet we still have a scenario in which the Cuban-American community's elected representatives reflect a different point of view. And so why is that? The first thing I would say is that there's a difference between the Cuban-American community in general, right? Everybody, regardless of your citizenship status, and those who are US citizens and have the right to vote. So I've often thought that as much effort and resources are put into courting support for engagement here in Washington, I'd like to see folks do a voter registration drive in Hialeah. I think that would help the cause. I think, as I said already, Cubans are not single issue voters. It's possible to have voted for Trump and not support his move on Cuba policy. But I would also say that this electoral picture may be changing. 2018 is going to be really interesting in Miami. I'm sure many of you know that the longtime representative, congressional representative, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen is retiring. And that race is quickly shaping up to be a rather dynamic one. This is one that the Democrats think that they can flip. The field is already incredibly crowded. Hard to predict, obviously, where that's going to end up. But if that seat flips, that could have pretty significant consequences for US Cuba policy. So I would agree, just last thought, that the rollback that we've seen under the Trump administration is significant. It's going to have real effects, but it's also nothing close to a complete cancellation of the deal, quote unquote. So I think it's for those of us who believe in the value of engagement, that there's still space to work and to continue to push and advocate for that agenda. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Mike. Jorge, please.
So I'm delighted to be back at the Inter-American Dialogue once again to chat about a topic that is excessively familiar in many ways. The conversations of this sort have been going on for a very long time, and I thought Emily's idea of the timeline was particularly helpful in that sense. So the way I would like to use my remarks, perhaps as not my usual mode, but I think it's helpful. How can the president's policies advance the president's goals? And so my own views will, I hope, be clear to you along the way, but it seems to me that's a good way to frame it, because this is the President of the United States, and we are thinking about the president's goals and the president's policies. So begin with the things that he has said. He has said, including over the last few days, that he cares about the value, the utility, the importance, and the right of the U.S. base near the Cuban city of Guantanamo. Whether the role of the base as a prison will or will not expand is a little unclear to me, but it will almost certainly continue as a prison for some indefinite period of time. And for that purpose, beginning with Bush 41 and continuing under Clinton, Bush 43, and Obama, and continuing now, there has been an effective collaboration between the U.S. and Cuban armed forces. And the reason for that is both sides have a similar interest. The U.S. doesn't want the prisoners to get out. The Cubans don't want the prisoners to get in. And therefore, to advance the president's goals with regard to Guantanamo, it makes sense to sustain the policies that the president inherited. Take a different topic, one of the signature questions during the Trump presidential campaign, on which he has continued to emphasize over the last several months of the first year of his administration, is migration. And as you have heard, therefore, the agreement signed in January 2017 fits perfectly the president's migration goals, and therefore the continuation of those inherited policies fits admirably well the president's goals. The easiest way to put it is that Cubans would be treated in the same way as everybody else under U.S. immigration law when they seek to enter the United States. The more important point is that they are bilateral agreements indicating the joint interest and the joint consent of the two governments that include not only treating Cubans in that way, but also for the U.S. to return Cubans who have attempted to enter the United States without proper documentations to Cuba, whether they are crossing the Straits of Florida or whether they are crossing the U.S.-Mexican border, and that Cuba would agree to accept them. That is a better agreement than the United States has with any other country in the world. It is a lot more effective. It is much more professional treatment for the U.S. Coast Guard and for other U.S. migration personnel involved in this issue. So to advance the president's goals, the policies that the president inherited on this issue area work very well also. Law enforcement. With regard to a variety of topics, certainly violent crime, but drug trafficking. The president has made it clear during his campaign and at various times during this first year of his presidency that he cares about the basket of issues that one would associate with regard to law enforcement. Cuba and the United States began to cooperate informally but steadily on law enforcement issues through the 1990s, and last summer of 2016, they formalized an agreement to make sure that security forces in both countries could be especially effective. And for anyone who reads through U.S. government reports with regard to whether other governments in other countries do or do not cooperate and advance the policies with regard to drug traffic interdiction and punishment of criminals associated with that line of work, Cuba shows up amazingly well. It's not just the policy commitment of the Cuban government, but the effectiveness of the Cuban government at doing exactly what President Trump's goals indicate Cuban government policy and Cuban government goals ought to be. So in this issue area as well, affirming the inherited policies that the Trump administration has received serve best the president's goals. Move on to a different topic. President has indicated at various times that he thinks with regard to international trade, the U.S. should enjoy surpluses. And if you apply that to Cuba, beginning at the start of the 21st century, early in the Bush administration, authorized by Congress, the United States became an agricultural exporter to Cuba. And that created by almost any calculation of percentage standards, a sensational, albeit in terms of monetary worth, only a few $billion, but a sensational trade surplus for the United States. Those policies of agricultural exports continued under the Obama presidency, have continued in 2017 under the Trump administration. The numbers, the amount for calendar 2016 was in the neighborhood of $245 million. The Civil Aviation Agreement, negotiated during the Obama administration, also fits well with the president's preference for asymmetric agreements that advance the economic interest of the United States. The agreement on paper looks like any normal civil aviation agreement where there is the rights established for both sides. In practice, Cuba has only one airline, Cuban Aviation, and it does not fly to the United States. So that all the traffic between the United States and Cuba necessarily adds to the one-sided economic advantage of the United States. And even the regulations that went into effect yesterday, as you look through it, the closer you get to a U.S. business interest, the less adversely they are affected. Marriott Starwood is doing just fine. It's important to bear in mind that even this element of asymmetric economic relations has the consent of the Cuban government. Because for the Cuban government, this is not an optimal deal, but it is a much better deal than not having this. Because it is what makes it possible to increase the number of visitors, as Emily indicated. It is what makes it possible to develop other areas of economic activity in a country where the best functioning one of the two best functioning economic sectors happens to be tourism. The other one is the love economy, Michael's remittances. What that also tells you is that on all of the issues that I am touching, the Cuban government may not like some of the new regulations that have gone into effect or the words that accompany these regulations, but it does not really have a better alternative. And what is interesting about the Cuban government response, beginning early in 2017, but particularly since June, is how remarkably tame it is, how remarkably moderate it is, because it does not have a better response. And this is what makes the continuation of these policies possible. The President indicated in his remarks in June that he also cared about fostering market economy openings in Cuba. And there are various ways in which there may or may not be a U.S. relationship with the Cuban market economy, but four pillars of it are visitors, flights, remittances, and permitting the kinds of economic activities such as Airbnb to which U.S. visitors may go. One of the things that is noteworthy about the regulations that went into effect yesterday is they affirm all four, as you heard first from Emily and then from Michael. Visitors can visit, flights may continue, remittances may be sent, and people are being steered into private bed and breakfast agreements, whether managed or not by Airbnb. It does not matter in this case. The Cuban private economy, particularly in the city of Havana, thrives under these arrangements, will function better under these arrangements. And to the extent that the President truly does believe in the goal he has articulated to support a market economy in Cuba, then the policies that yesterday's regulations reaffirmed advances the President's goals as well. Bear in mind, the Cuban government may be somewhat unhappy about elements of how its private sector economy may have been growing. There is some public evidence of that, but the Cuban government does not have a better alternative to grow its economy than to permit these activities. So once again, in this area, it consents to its evolution. Worth remembering, not in yesterday's regulations, but worth remembering that the President's budget proposal to the Congress, it may be dead on arrival because Ileana has not yet stepped down, but the Office for Management and Budget proposed to zero out the $20 million in USAID money out of Helms-Burton, and that is entirely consistent with the preferences of the Cuban government. Political changes, they have been alluded to already. The President, both by his words and by his actions, And the Secretary of State, by being even more explicit in his words to career Foreign Service personnel at the State Department, have indicated that regime change is not a top priority in general for the foreign policy of the United States. And the Secretary of State in particular has described it quite clearly. With regard to Cuba, that seems to be different. What is interesting is if one follows the logic of the remarks of the President and the Secretary of State, it is because there's not that much at stake in U.S.-Cuban relations that the administration believes that it can afford to pursue a policy that has the current components of regime change. But it is, even in that context, not pushing it enough to undermine or even to undercut the other presidential goals and policies that I have summarized. But to the extent that monitoring the presidential succession scheduled to take place in Cuba at the end of the month of February, it does make sense to continue diplomatic relations, as the Trump administration continues to affirm, to monitor a process of succession that may include not only President Raul Castro, but of course many other members of the leadership. It includes affirming Cuban-American travel. It includes affirming study abroad programs and the like, all because they are among the relatively few instruments that the United States has to try to facilitate, to encourage, to motivate possibilities of political change in Cuba, as does the President's remarks in June of 2017, where President Trump indicated that he would like to continue to negotiate with Cuba, in particular with regard to fugitives of justice, but more generally in regard of providing a variety of motivations and topics to be confirmed. The issue then with the regulations advanced yesterday, nearly all of which were anticipated by the President's remarks last June, could be put in the following way. The political news from yesterday, as opposed to the regulatory views from yesterday, political news from yesterday is how much of the inherited policies has been reaffirmed, down to the credit cards that you and I know we cannot in fact use, but they were part of the old regulations and have remained in the new regulations. It is noteworthy that some of Michael's representatives in Congress found the decisions yesterday not to have gone as far as they would have liked. And if you follow the line of argument I've been trying to present to you, it is because this more modest version of the regulations injures less the President's stated goals. And that is my take on the regulations. Regulations yesterday, for the most part, advance none of the President's goals. They get in the way of market opening activities. They make it more difficult to advance the kinds of practical objectives that are an element of a component of a presidential statement in June about fostering entrepreneurship in Cuba in the private sector. They are, for the most part, annoying. The impact on the Cuban government will require some relatively modest readjustments at the margins. More annoying they will be to U.S. travelers and to student groups or universities and colleges that wish to establish there. What is most adverse to the President's goals, what is truly counterproductive to almost any view of President's goals as he has articulated them, and on this point I end, is shredding the consulates in Havana and in Washington. People need to move to accomplish the kinds of objectives that the President has articulated. Preventing the issuance of visas is a gross mistake. The sooner it is corrected, the better. But I think we are better off if we try to think through and argue the kinds of lines that I've tried to sketch to you. For those who, like me, as I've just made clear, disagree with the regulations that went into effect yesterday, formulated in a way that tells the administration, we do understand a lot of what you're doing and a lot of what you're not doing. Stop there.
Great, terrific. Thank you so much, Jorge. So we've got a rich set of issues on the table. I'll take the prerogative to throw a first question out to all of you. If we take Emily's line graph metaphor and try to extend that out into the future, I think I heard from all of you that we're certainly on a downward slope at the moment, that the relations at the moment are going through a rocky period. But I also heard reasons for perhaps cautious optimism, some factors that point to underlying strength or resilience in the relationship, whether Emily's references to congressional support for trade and travel, whether Mike's discussion of the attitudes of the Cuban-American community, especially as it pertains to strong operating consulates in both countries that allow the movement of people that the community has become accustomed to, or Jorge's, I think, very kind of salient discussion of narrowly interpreted U.S. interests and how those are best advanced in many cases by a policy of continuity rather than one of change from the prior administration. So I guess being a little provocative, does that mean that you're all optimistic that a couple of years from now we will look back at this as sort of a low point, and that these underlying factors will over time put us in a better place in the bilateral relationship, or do you see a continuing kind of deepening of this current freeze? And if I could ask all of you in answering to make reference to what's happening in Cuba, especially the leadership change. I think many of us saw the video of Vice President Diaz-Canel that circulated recently, pointing to certainly no immediate change in some of the more kind of hardline policies from the Cuban government. So if you could reflect on the way in which events in Cuba itself may sort of shape this timeline if we extend it out, say, 24 months. Let's start maybe with Jorge this time, and we'll work backwards.
So let me take where your question comment just ended. So if you dial back to President Obama's visit to Havana, in retrospect, it was too successful. It scared the Cuban leadership. And beginning with Fidel Castro's last public act of defiance, he publicly criticized his brother for how the Obama invitation was handled. And it led to a period which had not ended by the time of the U.S. presidential election, and that has continued since that time, that has constrained what might have been further consequences of an opening of U.S.-Cuban relations in terms of Cuban domestic politics and freedom of expression, the kinds of concerns that Vice President Diaz-Canel articulated in that set of remarks in the video. There is a Cuban election coming up, not just a presidential succession that has been scheduled. Cuban elections have not received a vast amount of attention from the international press because in the National Assembly elections, as I suspect all of you know, it is an ideal electoral law if you're a politician. The number of seats is equal to the number of candidates, and so you will win. The interesting feature, less well known about Cuban electoral law, is that it has nevertheless retained 3 rights for the voter. I'm not counting abstentions, these people who show up to vote. One is you can vote blank. Second one is you can annul your ballot. And the third is you can vote selectively. For reasons that I've never understood, the Cuban government decided to cluster candidates. So in any district, You're electing between 2 and 5 people to the National Assembly. And so you can vote for candidate A and not for candidate B, even though you know that both A and B will become members of the National Assembly. But nevertheless, it is also clear that what the Cuban Communist Party and the mass organizations want you, dear voter, to do is to vote for el voto unido, the united slate. And so you could sum those 3 votes, blank, null, and selective, and call them not dissident. They're not dissident, but you can call them nonconforming. And in the 2013 National Assembly election, between 1/5 and 1/4 of the votes were nonconforming votes. 1.8 million Cubans choosing to vote in ways that are at odds with the preferences of the established political organizations. That's not a small matter. It was not a tiny number. It is one of the reasons why in the municipal election process that is now underway, the government is much more alarmed about who might be candidates that might be their case before. Suppose the Cuban electoral law said something such as this, that in a district with 2 to 5 candidates, the candidate with the fewest votes would be defeated. Not a radical idea. I mean, 5 candidates, 4 get elected, 1 loses. If that rule had been applied in the 2013 National Assembly election, 1/3 of the political bureau would have been defeated. That's part of the political context. It's not just a change of names. And if I were Vice President Díaz-Canel trying to become president of Cuba, I would do what politicians in any country do. Assume that those who would like an opening are already forming. The ones whom I like to, whom I need to win, because that's where the median voter in the electorate or so, the 1,000 people or so who will have an opinion on who may be in the team of the next president of Cuba, those are the ones who are afraid of the opening. And that, so if I were advising Díaz-Canel, which I assure I am not, I would have advised him to do exactly what he did in that video.
Great, thanks. Mike, estrangement or engagement?
You know, I'm not particularly optimistic at the moment about this dip just being a temporary thing. I guess it depends on how we define temporary, but certainly over the course of this administration, I don't see any real strong incentive for this administration to try to figure out the consular issue in particular. I think there's an element of the administration that would just as soon not issue as many visas to everybody, to be frank. And so there's an element of this that the kind of results, whatever we think about the measures that were taken to reduce the personnel and whether they were justified or not, the result is sort of even more consistent with the policy on immigration than the wet foot end of wet foot, dry foot is. So I don't think that that's particularly encouraging. I would also say that in terms of Cuba's internal dynamic, I mean, I think some of what Jorge has just described predates the Trump administration coming in. There was a way in which the manner in which the Obama opening was framed at times really rankled the other side. Politically, it had to be framed here, I think, as an argument of, well, if the old policy didn't work, let's try something else. The problem is work to what end? And that end, as the US defines it, Republican or Democrat, is not one that the Cuban government really liked. And still feels that way. So I think the notion that a nicer US policy would be a kind of a Trojan horse, that's something that was in the rhetoric and that Cuban authorities had begun to react to. So, you know, maybe counterintuitively, a policy, even if it's mostly rhetorically aggressive and most of the engagement has remained, or there's still a lot of avenues for that, the harsher rhetoric is something that's easier to deal with, I think, on the other side. And so I think there might be an element of Cuban political society that knows how to deal with this. I would say that there's but there is a new variable, and that variable, or there's several new variables. I mean, I think Cuba's economy is not doing great. They have not been able to meet their projected targets for growth. There was some positive news this past week about foreign investment, but the demographic problem is real. The sort of a stalling of the internal economic agenda. Things haven't moved, right? August, there was a freezing of issuing of new licenses for small business people. These are things that I think reactions to some of the things that were happening under Obama and don't help the scenario going forward. So I don't really know what the relationship is between the internal and the external. It's a complicated question, but I got to be honest, I'm not particularly optimistic. I think there are important avenues to keep engaging, to keep some of the travel going, and this is not going to be like falling off a cliff. But certainly the next year or two, I think we may be in for some inertia.
Great. Emily?
I think over a 10-year period, the trend line will continue to be positive. Over 2 years, I don't know. I'd like to think positive. I think, as I articulated in my remarks, that there has been a lot of momentum on travel, on business ties, on government dialogue, and that will, I do think, continue. But as we've all mentioned, Cuba is getting ready to head into a leadership transition, and we right now are acutely aware that during leadership transitions, there's a lot of rhetoric. There is a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of posturing, and it's unclear how that will affect the bilateral relationship. But I think I'll focus for a second on Congress, because I think it's really remarkable that despite the negative rhetoric from the Trump administration, and despite the June announcement, and despite the departments and agencies spending the last several months drafting new rules to restrict trade and travel, that there has been a concerted effort in Congress to gather co-sponsors to bills to either lift the embargo entirely or to erode elements of the embargo, and among Republicans. And I think that's really worth mentioning because some of the folks in Congress, and it's not just the Senator Flake, who has positioned himself publicly at odds with the administration, but some in the House who were among the first supporters of candidate Trump during the primary are the leaders on these bills to promote engagement, and they are the ones who are advocating to their colleagues the need to change our policy, and they have over the last 6 months gathered more Republican co-sponsors during this uncertain time, and I think that bodes well for a continued positive trend line.
Terrific. Okay. Well, that was a great, I think, introductory session. We're ready for your questions and comments. We'll take 3 at a time, and then hopefully have time for a few rounds. I see a couple of hands here. Dan, start with you.
Thank you. Dan Erickson with Blue Star Strategies. I just wanted to come back to the point of Cuban entrepreneurs, because it's possible, listening to the panel, to interpret this as possibly being good for Cuba's entrepreneurial sector, because it will push more of the visitors into that sector, or that it could be really negative. And so I wanted to know, what have you kind of seen or heard from entrepreneurs on the ground? How are they interpreting this? And then just a second question is kind of Cuban civil society. And what's the civil society reaction to this? Are people in favor or not? Thank you.
Thanks. Go right here.
Hi, good morning. Alex Sanchez. I'm a defense analyst. I write for Jane's Defense and some other places. And one question for Emily. You talked about, do you think that in a worst case scenario, the Trump administration could consider just shutting down the embassy and just going back to interest section? Or is this just too much of a red line and this could not happen, or something that could happen after the new Cuban president comes into power? And another question really quickly, I think maybe Michael can talk about it too. When you talked about all these businesses that your citizens cannot go to in Cuba. Can you talk more about which ones they are? You mentioned Airbnb, but are there like restaurants and stores that they cannot go to, and how is this enforced? Thank you.
Okay, got a question up here.
I'm Timothy Towell, former Foreign Service officer, 31 years, starting in the Kennedy administration. On the Cuban desk in 1968, consul in Cochabamba when Che Guevara died, poor fellow. Number 2 in the intersection, 79 and 80, so doing a great job, so we got Mariel. I'd like to ask a leadership question. Raul Castro is the great guy that opened up Cuba into the 20th century. In my day, old days, he was the bad guy. He didn't give 8-hour speeches, but he ran the army, the intelligence service, and the police. He protected his brother from the bad guys, probably killed Camilo Cienfuegos, sent attractive Che Guevara on great missions out of the country to keep him away, sent him to Montevideo, sent him to Angola, sent him to Bolivia, how ridiculous. So he's a bad guy and used a company called Gaviota Turismo, which we've been talking about, to make money for the army, the police, and the intelligence service. So in my book, and I'm old-fashioned, he's a bad guy. So, you know, is he not? Is he changed? Is he going to heaven? Did he have a, you know, what happened to him?
All right, okay. We don't get a lot of is he going to heaven questions around here, so that's good. Emily, let's start with you.
I'll take Dan's question. I was in Havana in June during the president's announcement, and my itinerary was to meet with a number of Cuban entrepreneurs to get their assessment of the U.S. policy debate in advance of the announcement. And I happened to be there when the announcement was made. And President Trump, in his remarks, said that his policy toward Cuba was designed to support the Cuban private sector, and it was designed to divert funds away from government, certain government coffers and into the Cuban private sector. And the folks I was meeting with were pretty clear that that was not the, they did not think that the policy would have that effect. And a month later, we brought a number of them up to Washington so that they could make their voices heard in the D.C. debate. They met with State Department, with Commerce, with a number of members of Congress, and presented some policy recommendations as to how U.S. policy can best support the Cuban private sector. But in that month interim between the announcement and their advocacy tour, they had all experienced a number of cancellations. And their overarching sentiment was that negative rhetoric and ambiguity in our policy deters travel and deters engagement, and in the short term had seen the impact of that. And now, fast forward to present day, in the wake of the travel warning, they have seen a further reduction in cancellations. And the Cuban private sector it's not all hospitality focused. We had a couple of folks on the advocacy delegation who serve Cuban clients, but the Cuban clients who they serve are, many of them, in the hospitality sector and have extra resources because of the increased travel, primarily of U.S. travelers, increased resources to be able to contract an event planner to plan their wedding, or to post ads in a private magazine, or to hire a fancy photographer to come and do some ads for their hospitality-facing business. And all of the hospitality sector had experienced acutely the short-term impact of the ambiguity of the policy and the negative rhetoric, but the secondary market, I'll call it that, was starting to feel the impact, and I fear that that's going to be felt more in the coming months. That said, I've also heard from the travel industry that there's a sense of relief that the rules have finally come out. What was really hurting the travel industry from their perspective was the months-long drafting process and the fear of what was coming and the uncertainty and the rules that stated if you bought your ticket before the announcement, or was it before the implementation of the rules, or was it, before President Trump was elected? What were the different goalposts? And the average traveler from the United States would just as soon wait until the dust settles before traveling. And I think from the travel industry's perspective, yesterday the dust began to settle, and there will be a clearer view on the path of on the ways to travel still to Cuba legally, and that will have an impact of supporting the Cuban private sector down the road.
I don't have much to add to Emily's response on the small business side. I just say that, one of the weird regulatory things that we kind of have to figure out, and I think the travel industry is going to have to figure out, is that if individual people-to-people travel is now not possible and you have to go in a group again, this expanded definition of support for the Cuban people, which looked a lot like what people-to-people was, whether there is enough momentum to sort of funnel people into that and convince people that it's okay, or people sort of get on board that train, I think that's to be seen. I think, in addition to the fear of leading up to the regulations, the other thing that may impact things going forward is just this sort of negative news around this. I think people often aren't as into the weeds reading State Department or Treasury Department regulations as I was yesterday, and they just hear, oh, I can't go anymore, and then that's the end of it, and they decide to go somewhere else. So I think there may be a dip further, and the small business sector, certainly that I've interacted with and heard from, they're very concerned about it. I don't see how decreasing the overall numbers, even if of U.S. travelers, even if just by adding confusion, helps that sector. So to the question on enforcement, it's a good question. The list of banned enterprises, I think, is 180-ish. Most of that list is comprised of various hotels that are joint ventures between, or not all, but many are joint ventures between a foreign company and Gaviota, or another branch of the Cuban or a state company that's linked, or is at least accused of being linked to the Cuban armed forces. But there's also some really strange things on there. You can't engage with, I think, Tropicola, which is a producer of soda, but it doesn't list another brand of soda that is also made. So we're now in the business of telling Americans which brands of soda they can drink. Rum too, there's some rum brands listed, but not others. So as far as getting rid of, if the mantra of this administration is stripping away useless regulations, this seems to fly in the face of that. But enforcement is a key thing, right? Cuba's economy is basically a cash economy, especially from the tourist perspective, or at least the U.S. tourist perspective. So how to figure out how to audit the receipt of which brand of Coke I drank, I don't really know if that's so feasible. And I also don't know that if that's the point. I mean, I think the point is just to create sort of regulatory muck to kind of disincentivize people from potentially going. I have not heard of any dramatically increased budget at OFAC to staff this. I'd like to think they have more important things to worry about. So we'll have to see if there's any really enforcement follow through, greater auditing. I do think that the enforcement piece might fall disproportionately on some kinds of folks. There's new wording in there that I'm still trying to parse and figure out about educational travel, about study abroad programs. Jorge, I know, has experience with dealing with the bureaucracy on those matters, and I think their U.S. university study abroad programs may be an easily identifiable and conspicuous target. And then in terms of civil society, and I'll just end with this, I mean, that's a loaded term, as we know, and it's a complicated one. What I would say is that if there is a sector of civil society that's dramatically on board with the Trump administration's policies, I don't think they don't speak for the vast majority. I would include civil society, quote unquote, just everyday people. And this is not being seen favorably. I think there's an incredible the normalization process had its ups and downs. I think there were overinflated expectations about what it would bring or how quickly from the average Cuban's perspective. There were some clear winners in that process. There were others not so much. But the idea that we would go back, even if just a half step, and still get back on track 10 years later, that is just an incredibly disappointing thing, particularly for young people who have made a conscious decision to stay when some have had the opportunity to leave and have seen most of their friends growing up end up where I live in Miami or elsewhere. And so to now be going back to this kind of old story, I think it's a really tough pill to swallow. And so, I hope it doesn't last long.
Jorge, do you want to take on the question of Raul Castro's legacy?
Yes, very much so, because it's a very good question, and you're quite right to focus on him. It's noteworthy that there are many, and have long been many, biographies of Fidel Castro, but not one good one of Raul Castro. But moreover, it is analytically important still today, given that Raul will remain as first secretary of the Cuban Communist Party after the February presidential transition, it remains pertinent to think about him. So first point is the contrast. If one takes a long time span of Raul Castro's life, he first appears in the public arena in 1958 when troops under his command, rebel troops under his command, kidnapped a whole bunch of U.S. citizens. And the subsequently available archival information made it clear that at the time his brother Fidel Castro thought that Raul was an extremist and nearly crazy. And so there was a real difference of opinion between the two brothers. Jump forward to the mid-1960s, it is his ministry that is responsible for, and it is him as minister who most resists ending the program, known as the UMAP, the Unidades Militares de Ayuda a la Producción, military units for aid production, which were in effect coerced labor camps where a variety of people were sent, most notably thousands of those accused to be homosexual. It is Raul Castro who invites Obama to Havana. It is Raul Castro's daughter, Mariela, who is the principal public advocate of affirming that being gay is not a crime under the laws of the Republic of Cuba, and adopting a number of practical policies, including police retraining, to make sure that this is affirmed. In 1968, Cuba's mini version of a cultural revolution called the Revolutionary Offensive, Raul Castro publicly affirms, we did not make a revolution to protect the right to trade, and leads to the expropriation of these clearly salient activities like barbershops and beauty salons and hot dog stands and plumbers, all of which now become state enterprises. It is the same Raul Castro who in 2010, fall of 2010, announces what comes to be known as the policy to update the Cuban economy, the lineamientos that opens up a significant growth for all of these small private business activities. Two very different kinds of behavior. The first time I noticed a split between the two brothers is in the early 1990s. In the middle of a severe economic crisis, when Raul Castro publicly gives an interview, he had his favorite journalist give him a planted question: what is the greatest threat to Cuban national security today? And Raul Castro's answer was frijoles, beans. Cubans have to eat, and it is only after that that you have Fidel Castro authorizing policy changes in the private sector. So the interesting question is, were today's Raul's views always his views, which he had suppressed them, just as other people are known to suppress their sincere views at a moment in time? I don't think so. And that's why I mentioned the 1958 decision to kidnap the bunch of U.S. citizens. I think that this is a man who genuinely learned. Learning meaning he changed his substantive views on important questions. He changed his substantive views not just from deep reading, but because the world had changed, and he, unlike his brother, was prepared to adjust to these changes. And that might not get into heaven, but at least to purgatory.
Peter.
What I've heard so far is what the U.S. reaction to Trump is going to be, how the U.S. may or may not perform, what kind of relationship. The Cubans have a role in this, I presume. They have to make choices about their reaction to the new policy agenda of the Trump administration. Now, we see some countries have gotten angry. Some politicians in Latin America get angry at the United States and call for resistance, and others, perhaps the wide majority, are ready to accommodate sort of the Trump presidency and try to find ways of continuing. Is there any debate, discussion about how the Cuban government ought to respond to the Trump initiative, Trump policies, let's say?
Let's go to the gentleman here, and then we'll finish up with Mark.
Good morning. I'm Wally Crenshaw, Geocentric Development Group at Howard University, adjunct faculty in global strategy. My questions really revolve around the macro level. As the policies continue to shift, there was a conversation about eliminating the 10% tax on U.S. Dollars at the exchange level. You know, how is that impacting or continues to impact moving forward? Secondly, the question around the consolidation of the currency from Moneda Nacional to CUC, and how is that going to impact kind of moving things forward? And then lastly, 3, 4 months, 5 months ago, there's a dialogue on both sides of the aisle, Democrat and Republican, about a real serious discussion about the elimination of the blockade. Has that died completely? Or do we see some of that continue to happen behind the scenes and expect something to happen in the future with that?
Mark Schneider.
Mark Schneider, CSIS. This goes to the question, Jorge, of your linking Trump goals and the policy decisions. And to some degree, it also goes to the question of where Raul is. This relates to Venezuela. And from the standpoint of the Trump administration, Venezuela is one of the few areas in Latin American policy where he has been very outspoken and clearly opposed to the direction of events in Venezuela towards a more dictatorial regime. And in that context, obviously, one of the few nations that seems to have some influence in Venezuela is Cuba. So the question is, does the recent policy decisions, one, have any effect on Cuba's willingness to play a useful role, or is it simply unrelated and there's unlikely to be any shift in the Cuban policy with respect to Venezuela?
Thanks, Mark. Let's start there. Jorge, if you want to take that question, and we'll move backwards.
So, to Peter's question, I would say the Cuban government has, by its actions, and more recently by its words, signaled very clearly how it is thinking about this. It is prepared to continue, go down the list. Guantanamo, migration, civil aviation, and the like. Cuban government is all set with that. The response to, whether it was the response to the new regulations or the response to the speech in June, the self-discipline with which Cuban government officials have responded is noteworthy, at a minimum, to put it very mildly. This is a highly professional team, long in office, from Raul Castro all the way down, and this is their view. And I think, honestly, the reason is they do not have a better alternative. It is not better for them to tear up some of these things to retaliate against the United States. And my assumption is, as much as they dislike having to accommodate and adjust to the Trump administration, that they have, and they will likely continue to do so. Mark, to your question on Venezuela, I'll leave your very good questions on the CUC and the PESO, although let me just say, my first conversation about, in just a few months, we will have exchange rate unification, was in 1997 with the then economy minister, Jose Luis Rodriguez, who thought that this was the way to go. So, you know, this is the 20th anniversary of that conversation, which is so I remember it. But on Venezuela, I have thought for some time that the Cuban government would be willing to be part of some international arrangement with regard to Venezuela. I don't think this takes an enormous amount of mental effort. The Cubans who come back from service in Venezuela, the tens of thousands who have done so, you know, do keep saying this is not a competent government. Moreover, it's also not a revolutionary government. They may not then take the logical step, what the heck are we doing here? But it is not. And this incumbent president, unlike Hugo Chavez as his predecessor, lacks an additional array of skills, not just competence. So it's not inconceivable for Cuba to say that our main interest is to save our partnership with Bolivarian Venezuela, of which this particular incumbent is an obstacle. Would the Trump administration be prepared to engage with the Cubans as administrations in the past were prepared to engage with President Uribe in Colombia over negotiations and dealings? It's not unreasonable to do that, but you know, that remains to be seen. Even in the context of, but you know, what could be, are there any Cuban additional signals, let me rephrase it that way, not specifically on Venezuela, that suggest a Cuban willingness to say to the Trump administration, if you move a little bit, we're prepared to move a little bit. Cuban foreign minister response to the President Trump's June speech was, you want to negotiate over fugitives? Let's negotiate over fugitives. It didn't go any further because there was no subsequent response from the U.S., but it was not saying no. The sonic attacks, there's more than both governments could do, but one thing that the Cuban government did, which it had not done for a half century, was to invite the FBI to come repeatedly. Again, one could imagine undertaking additional activities on both sides. But it's not as if the Cuban government has just simply sat on its hands and been grumpy. It's sustaining the agreements and it's indicating a willingness to pick up a conversation, but it requires both sides.
I want to build on Jorge's answer to Peter's question. You know, there are, I mean, I would agree with Jorge that the response from the Cuban government has been quite measured throughout the sort of lead up, particularly on the sonic attacks issue. Although I would note that I think more recently the tone has notched up a little bit. I sense a kind of degree of annoyance that some of those perhaps signals that you've just sent, yeah, exactly, have that the offer hasn't been taken up, so to speak. So we'll see, you know, whether that continues or is a momentary thing. I do think there are things that the Cuban government can do to respond directly to some of the inconvenience and hindrances that are going to be the results of whether the announcements the other day or the reduction in diplomatic personnel. I mentioned that Cuba's embassy is left with one consular officer that has to process a difficult amount of paperwork. Cubans, it's worth noting, if you're born in Cuba but want to go visit, you cannot enter with a passport of, say, another country where you've been naturalized. You need to go with a Cuban passport or at least a Cuban entry visa if you left before 1970, I believe. So there's a lot of paperwork. The Cuban passport is valid for 6 years. but it has to be renovated or renewed every 2. It's an expensive proposition. The Cuban government did recently take an important step in getting rid of something called the habilitación of the passport, which I guess the best way to translate is sort of an activation of the passport, although I would say if they issue you a passport, why isn't it active? So that's an important kind of bureaucratic thing that's been stripped away. There's other things that one could do. This renew every 2 years thing. Get rid of that, you reduce the workload at the consulate here, and maybe help more Cuban Americans continue to go more easily, more frequently. That seems to be really in their interest to do that. But on the other hand, there's a way in which I kind of hope that the Cuban government, whether on matters of the economy or politics or society, won't base its decisions entirely on the dynamic bilaterally. Cuba's future does not depend only on its relationship with the United States, as much as those ties are of singular intimacy and always will be probably. There are issues at stake in terms of the functioning of the economy internally, in terms of the functioning of the political system, conversations that have been going on in Cuban society through ups and downs that frankly don't have much to do with the bilateral dynamic. And what I worry about is a sort of downturn in tone of the bilateral dynamic kind of shaping that other conversation or inhibiting it. And so in a way, I hope that the Cuban government kind of keeps tending to its business, the business of its people. Obviously, in a context bilaterally that's more complicated and full of obstacles, but there are many other pending issues and conversations that aren't about that. And I hope that whether it's the dual currency thing, many others that one can mention, I hope that sort of they keep their eyes on the prize, so to speak.
Emily, final word.
I will address first your question about conversations to end the embargo between Republicans and Democrats. What we've seen recently is more of a constituent-driven effort to advocate for the end of the embargo. And it's come in the last 2 years when businesses have traveled down to Cuba and discovered what opportunities they have, when there has been more opportunity for travel, more opportunity for educational exchanges. The farmers can all but taste the increase in their sales if the U.S. government were to allow for the use of financing in agricultural sales. And you've seen these constituent groups advocating to their members to do something, to change the way that we engage with Cuba and to ultimately lift the embargo. And so, yes, is the short answer to your question. Those conversations are happening and they're continuing, and I think they will continue apace even despite the current chill in the bilateral relations. And then I neglected to answer your question about the embassy closing. I think it's important to bear in mind the process behind the ordered departure that we're in right now. It's my understanding that no ordered departure can last longer than 180 days. And when that clock started is a bit unclear. But I think that we are coming up in, be it February or the months following, on an up or down decision by the State Department whether or not to reinstate our diplomats. I do not think the down will be a closing of the embassy, and I can't speak for certain on that. But my understanding is that were the department to determine that it is safe to send our diplomats back, we would return to status quo and have diplomats and families back. Were they determined that there is still a risk to our diplomats, and that the departure must remain in place, then the post would revert to unaccompanied, which means no family members could move back down, and that staffing levels could remain as is at skeletal levels or could gradually tick back up. But I think that's an important decision point. And in questions, in conversations with the State Department, I've tried to tease out what the criteria are that are being used to make these determinations about whether it is safe to send our diplomats back, and that's a conversation that will be had in the next several months. But I do not anticipate, if I had to make a bet, I don't anticipate that the embassy would revert back to an interest section at this point.
Well, this has been an incredibly rich and informative discussion. Clearly, a lot on the table, and a lot of things we'll be tracking at this kind of dynamic time in U.S.-Cuba relations. I want to thank Jorge Dominguez, Mike Bustamante, and Emily Mandrala for, thank you. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and your mornings with us. Thank you all for being here, for your excellent questions, and hope to see you again soon at the dialogue.